How's it going, Chasers? I hope you're having a kick-ass week. Today I have an excerpt from the Chase the Craft podcast, which you can find at chasethecraft.com. And today this is with Matt Drew, who is a professional maltster. He's giving us an overview of what the malting process is. Stay tuned for the next video where Matt talks specifically about how to malt barley at home with very little equipment. That'll be coming out in about 3 days. Alternatively, you can go and listen to the full podcast, which is available now. All right, mate, let's get into the meat and potatoes of malting. So I think first, do you want to go over it from a kind of a high-level theory point of view of what malting is, and then we can kind of get into the specifics of how you do it.
Sure.
After that.
So the purpose behind malting, if anybody has ever taken a raw barley kernel and tried to chew it, it'll break your teeth. And there are a number of reasons for that. The first one is, and the main one is, that all of the stored energy in that barley kernel, because the kernel is designed obviously as a seed to grow the next generation of that plant. And so it has to have as much compact, complex carbohydrate stored up as possible in order to give that plant the energy it needs to get to the point where then the roots and photosynthesis can take over to finish the process. And so what malting is a controlled germination process. And it happens in 3 stages. The first one is steeps and air rests. And that's basically designed. So if and I can talk about the anatomy of a barley kernel from a very general perspective. Basically, you've got your endosperm, you've got your embryo, you've got an alurone layer that surrounds the endosperm, and the alurone layer is where once you get the moisture content of that grain to a certain point, enzyme synthesis starts to happen. So what happens is the moisture, which is absorbed through a sponge on the basal end of that kernel called the micropyle, it basically is soaked into that barley kernel, and it hydrates kind of outside in from the base up. And so typically, if you were to look at a diagram of a barley kernel, the one point where if you ever have like they call it steely tips, where some of that grit is not fully modified and friable when it's still hard, that's wise, because that's the hardest part of that barley kernel to hydrate. And what you have to do in the beginning of the malting process is, first of all, you have to understand what kind of barley you're starting with. And that's important because different barleys are going to have, in general, different protein levels. And for, like, if you're talking about in terms of distilling and enzyme potential and conversion potential, you want to have a nice balance between high extract, but also you want to have a high enough protein where it brings diastatic power and enough enzyme potential in order to fully convert all of that high extract carbohydrate. And so what happens is, once you hit about 33% moisture content of that grain, and you're starting anywhere between like 6 and in a perfect world, 6 and like 9.5% moisture content on the high side. And what you're doing is you're steeping that grain, you're getting it wet, and you are going to start the process of germination. Once you get to a certain point, and you just have to get the feel for it, because the barley will tell you, if you know what to look for and you know how to ask it, the barley will tell you what it needs you to do. And you're going to let it soak for hours, and then you're just going to let it rest. You're going to drain that water out. You're going to let that barley kind of dry out a little bit and realize that it wants to start waking up. And that's typically, you're going to be at about 25% moisture content. And so you want to make that grain really thirsty so that when you go into your second steep cycle, it's really ready to take that water in and get that process kickstarted. Generally speaking, you don't want to go into a third steep. Sometimes you have to. There are in cases of really high protein barley or other extenuating circumstances, there are going to be times where you're going to need to go into a third steep. On the production scale and the commercial world, what we're seeing is more and more big, large scale malt houses call their third steep the beginning of germination, because what they'll do is they'll lay all that grain out in their germination vessels, and they'll just start dumping water on it in there and just let that water trickle down through the grain bed. And that essentially does the same thing, but more efficiently. And they can start the process earlier in the germination stage. And so from an efficiency perspective there, that also helps. Plus, that opens up the steep tank for them to get the next batch steeped in and going. So
the first step is essentially just telling the seed you've got an environment to grow in.
Yep, time to go.
Start making a new plant.
You hit about 33% moisture content of that grain, and germination is gonna be pretty much in full effect. So what's happening though is that as that moisture content is growing through that grain, you're softening that barley kernel, you're softening that endosperm, and at the same time you're telling the alurone layer, hey, start getting those enzymes going, because we need to start breaking down these complex carbohydrates, because that's the energy potential that grain needs in order to grow the next generation of that plant. So as you're hydrating that grain, you're softening the kernel, and then you're also giving those enzymes a really it's a path of least resistance, really, for them to go in, and the enzymes will start breaking down those complex carbohydrates into simple, shorter chain sugars, sucrose, fructose, galactose, maltose. I mean, dextrose. I mean, there's all kinds of different sugars and all kinds of different enzymes that play a role. Funny, so not funny, but interesting sort of bit of trivia, diastatic power, which everybody knows, everybody who's got, any background in fermenting grain or fermenting with grain understands and has heard the term diastatic power. And that comes from back in the 1800s, when we started figuring out, we were just in the very beginning stages of understanding what enzymes were. The enzyme was called diastase. And so the diastatic power was essentially the measure of diastase or enzyme package in that grain. And now we know that it's alpha amylase, it's limit dextrinase. I mean, there's different components to it, but that's kind of an interesting sort of side note, is that's where that word comes from.
So that word was just a catch-all for the magic stuff that takes what is in this and turns it into something that yeast can eat.
Yep. When you get that grain to about 42 to 44% moisture content, that's when you've got, as long as you're starting with good quality malting barley grain, and at least 95% of your kernels are showing signs of germination or chit. And a chit is just the white nub that starts popping out the bottom or the basal end of the barley kernel, and that's what is going to become the rootlets and then the acrospire or the stem of the next plant. So once that starts happening, then you go into germination. You control that germination process, typically 3 to 4 days it takes. Mm-hmm. And again, the job of the maltster, it's really equal parts art and science, because you have to understand from a biochemical perspective what you're starting with and what your limitations and parameters are in order to control that process. But the artistry comes in the fact that you're trying to dance with Mother Nature, and Mother Nature is a bitch. She sucks.
She'll do what she wants.
Yeah, she'll do what she wants when she wants. But
once you've germinated to the point that you're happy with it, you need to halt that process, right? Because you don't want a new baby barley plant. You want malt. What's the next step in the process?
Part of that is understanding where you need to stop, what that point is you're looking at, and that's going to vary depending on the malt type and what kind of malt you're making. But let's put it in terms of just like a base malt that you're going to use for an all malt, if you're making a single malt. How you establish what that point is kind of two things. The first one is you want to do a steep index, and you want to figure out how well hydrated that grain is. And there's a very easy test. It's called a Chapin test. CHAPON. So you can Google it and look up how to do it. But basically, you just take a little bit of barley, put it in a tea ball, you boil it, you put it in boiling water for a while. There's a specific time that you put it in there, and then you pull it out. You take 100 kernels, you split them down the middle, and you can tell by looking at the inside of that endosperm how much is hydrated and how much isn't. Because it's like, does it look chalky or does it look translucent? If it's translucent, it's hydrated. If it doesn't, then it's not. So that's going to show you how well hydrated your grain is, and that's going to indicate how well modified it's going to be, because you can't modify or malt that section of the kernel that isn't well hydrated. And so the other part of it is you're going to look at that acrospire growth throughout the whole process. And same thing, you just take a sample of barley kernels, you peel the husk off on the dorsal side, and then you look at the grain and you measure the length of that acrospire, or that tiny little stem, in relation to the length of the entire kernel. And so if you're making a well-modified base malt for all malt distilling, you're going to want to have at least 92% of those kernels in the 3/4 to 1 range. 1 being that the length of that acrospire is equal to the length of the kernel. The kiln is going to be the tool that you use, first of all, to stop germination, stop modification, and basically freeze the process in place. That is broken into 3 different phases. The first one is called free dry. And free dry is, we're talking about the moisture content of the grain when you start it, right? So the grain, that's a tappy spot. That's a tappy place. It wants to be at about that moisture content. And so above that is all basically free moisture that you just have to dry off. And the grain isn't going to have any problem drying that off at all. It's like, yeah, I don't want that anyway. I don't need that. And so it's basically low temperature, really high fan speed, and blowing off that moisture as quickly as possible. Bear in mind too, that the malt type that you're making is going to be in part defined by how much enzyme that finished malt brings to the table. And the higher temperature that you kiln at, the more enzyme destruction you're going to have. So if you want a high enzyme malt, you're going to want to kiln at low temperature. And like, again, going back to the all malt distilling, you're really not going to want to kiln up to more than 54 C.
Why don't you just always kiln at that sort of temperature?
Flavor.